I think of AI and its potential for transformative good and its potential for great harm. So the human rights framework itself underscores anti-discrimination principles, which are its bedrock guarantees. And AI has potential to disrupt the entire ecosystem and the human condition. So the design and development and use of the data and AI can be flawed, even as we acknowledge the potential for its great good. And this is the next frontier for human rights. And the human rights framework is yet to acknowledge or address these great threats.
Let's take action. All the people in positions of power are white males, or in those days. And now they may be white males and Asian males, in technology companies. And so there's not the personal experience like at Airbnb, that even though they were noticing so many customer complaints of people saying, I didn't get accepted into a residence because I'm Black. They had that happen throughout, but they never looked at it as a problem. They never had a Black person in there who could say, long before technology and Airbnb, Black people couldn't get into regular hotels. My grandmother tells us stories where we couldn't check into hotels because we were Black. So what's the surprising thing here? It is the same thing. It's just happening digitally and at a larger scale.
So there's a lot of situations where, because of a false facial recognition match, someone will get wrongfully arrested. We've seen situations of, an algorithm. So an example is, a rent screening algorithm that automatically tries to assess if an applicant for an apartment is a suitable fit based off of, different heuristics. And, if that algorithm is incorrect, which happens, then that individual will not get housing. So I think people underestimate the reality of the fact that a lot of these tools are just not ready yet for deployment. And even if they were, we would have to think a lot more critically about how we evaluate them and specifically think about what that evaluation needs to look like when considering or reflecting on the impact on vulnerable populations.
So as you said, it was very early in my career as a diplomat, I realized that women were missing at the table. And it was 2005 in Sarajevo, and we celebrated the 10 years of the Dayton Peace Agreement. And it had been negotiated in Dayton, Ohio, and was really viewed as a great US diplomatic triumph and success of the Clinton administration, as it ended a disastrous war for Europe. And all personalities which sat at the negotiation tables were there in the first row on the stage. And as you said, not a single woman. Because the space at the negotiation table was open to men who had the power of armed forces behind them, and women were just seen as victims. And even now, that more women are sitting at the table, as you said, their place is mostly not at the center of it. And it's why I'm happy to share some work that I did at MIT and some thoughts on how AI can be an opportunity for women leadership.
So my point is, bias is not specific for AI, but it is an underlying problem that we can see in medicine with or without AI. But AI systems are developed and trained using data from historical data sets. So they are very vulnerable to mirror bias present in the data.
And that's because diversity truly matters. And in conversations that stakeholders have around the ideation and design and implementation and deployment of an AI system, it's quite important to make sure that you are receiving and responding to that diverse group of stakeholders' feedback, including their complaints, including their concerns. If they're only a certain ethnicity, centered gender, making all these decisions for an AI system, I won't be shocked that AI will just build on the unfairness and bias that exist in the society, or even make it.
I don't know about the trends in auditing, and no, we do not audit, and we do not think this way.
And now you're going to start doing that, Josh.
I think there's some really important questions that stem from this that are really thought provoking. So yes, I think we need to do more. I don't know what that looks like, honestly, but this is really enlightening. So that my answer would be an embarrassing one, sort of one like let's not put that on the front page of the New York Times, you know.
This is great. If we've achieved one thing out of this lab, it would be to make Fastly do an audit. So that's
Not
great.
meet yet, in the sense that it's clear that bias is somewhat a concern in the regulation, but not nearly enough as I would think. Like if I have to, list the top 5 things that keep me up at night when I think about algorithmic decision-making, bias is top 2, if not top 1, right? So and it's not really reflected in the regulation. They mention it a little bit, but just say something, you have to put mechanisms in place for bias. That's not enough. I don't know what that means.
So as we approach kind of using more nuanced methods in AI, it gets a little bit more general. But the main thing to underscore there is that it's still all about the data. Because if you're training a machine learning model, the most important thing is the information that you're feeding into it. And that's where it kind of comes in, the importance of having humans in the loop still, so that machine telling angle of having humans in the loop and continuously updating the machine learning models. So for any kind of social related problem that we're trying to, of course, not fix, but approach understanding and trying to help as many people facing the problem as possible, is that it's going to always be an iterative process.
And so at any rate, our kind of disproportionate investment in female entrepreneurs is only intentional in the sense that we do have an internal program to make sure we give extra looks to certain entrepreneurs, but it's not really, quote unquote, diversity program. I think it's a consequence of the population that we are trying to target.
And that's the situation we are in AI right now. People are building these advanced tools, which can be used for both good and bad. Facial recognition is in one area. Another area of concern, though, is in autonomous weapons. Well, Craig Newmark Philanthropies has funded the development of course editions where people studying computer sciences would study other additional syllabus material where they would have to consider the ramifications of what they do. Because all tools, all technology can be abused, but until very recently, people in my field, computer sciences, were never trained to think about the ramifications of the tools that they're building today.
And one of the things that we've just launched is the open source auditing project, and run. So that's an effort to do 3 things, is to say, okay, for those people out there who call them algorithmic auditors, what are they finding? What are the tools they need? What are the things that they're building by hand where you think, if there were an open source library or a tool that were involved, it would help a lot. And then I could focus on the work that I'm trying to do, not building the tools. So a second thing that we've had going on for a little bit longer is a project called Common Voice. And the goal of that is to make voice recognition accessible to all. And by accessible, we mean, your voice can be heard and recognized, and your language can be heard and recognized. So Common Voice is currently, I think, the largest open source data set, in the world.
So, and when you use the term AI, it discourages people from questioning what is the specific technology you're using to translate that data into decisions. So it's not that the computation should be inherently more or less biased. And I think by opening it up, you can see whether it's your past behavior. Is it is it that we could say these are the 9 criteria, let's make this, and how we weight them, and not worry about the past, and that the AI should in fact be the tool that lets you interrogate the past behavior and discover the bias.
Right.
Not replicate.
In regards to my work on transgender folks in AI, I think, the fundamental thing that I think about when I think about the experience of trans folks and how that's mediated by all kinds of technology is that, much of my work focuses on the way that not complex AI systems, not neural nets or deep learning, but even the most fundamental basic parts of our technological systems buy into the false binaries of both gender and sex, the belief that there are two genders or the belief that there are two sexes, right? And how understanding how those binaries are false can lead us to make much better decisions in the world and think in a much more complex, rich way, whether we're talking about the experiences of trans folks or not.
We lack a robust ethics ecosystem in the case of AI. There's still wide recognition that applications of AI face deep challenges, especially concerns about fairness and bias. That's the most prominent kind of concern in the public.
Right now, we have companies out there who are trying to build automated driving algorithms. Those algorithms need to be able to detect cars. They need to be able to detect bicycles and other vehicles. They need to be able to detect pedestrians. So far, these papers are not as good at detecting darker skinned pedestrians as they are at detecting lighter skinned pedestrians, which means that if you put these systems out in the world without finding ways to address these biases, you are, statistically speaking, going to kill a disproportionate number of people of color based on the data that you're feeding into these systems. So this is leading some companies to do interesting and perhaps responsible things. There are now companies that are collecting data in the global south, in Ghana specifically, to try to get used to an environment where your pedestrians are people of color.
Making decisions about who's a good risk for a mortgage without knowing anything about bias, to which the machine learning developer person might say, or anybody else might say, well, no, it's, yeah, okay, let's say it's gender blind, but it's still reflecting historical bias that's sort of baked into the data. And so, well, what can we do? And the machine learning person might say, well, okay, tell you what, let's look at the percentage of male and female applicants who should have gotten a loan and did not, because machine learning is always approximate, it's statistical, there's always going to be some errors. So let's take a look at how many errors it made. How many worthy women didn't get loans as a percentage versus men. And it turns out that 60% of the women who didn't get loans upon further inspection should have. But only 30% of the men who should have gotten loans didn't. So 60% of the women lost the opportunity to get a loan.
So more broadly, in an ethics of AI framing, you have very different questions, right? The key questions is, AI needs large quantities of data, so how are we going to protect people's privacy? How can we empower marginalized communities and make sure they're not exploited? How are we going to demystify AI for everyone? How are we going to prevent algorithmically created and distributed misinformation? But we base these questions on a notion of society, on a notion of relationships that we already have. We don't question whether these relationships between North, South, between men, women, between different genders, whether they are correct, whether they're equal, and what is it going to do if we expect AI to simply conform broadly to these ethical standards?
We need to create the framework to audit, to make people responsible, because algorithms are made by people.
Mm-hmm.
They are made by humans. They are not made by algorithms. So we need to be able to audit, to understand what's going on, transparency, to make people accountable, and also to assess their impact on society. And that's why I mentioned, Professor Rangita mentioned in the beginning, we need to have this kind of interoperability between law and computer science, because we are talking about very complex and opaque systems. So we need computer scientists, computer science students to understand what's going on. And then we need the law people to create the regulations.
We really need systems that can reflect, nuanced needs and expose their limitations. I hope, like in this room, we're kind of beyond the setting that AIs will kind of solve all our problems, but still a lot of the world kind of thinks that way. That AIs will remove biases because humans are biased, right? Well, it is true that humans are biased, but AIs have a different set of biases that they bring. And what we really need are ways in which humans and AIs can reduce each other's, warts and weaknesses and build upon.
So we've got another interesting concept under European law is that, not all AI is created equally. And you've got kind of low risk AI, higher risk AI, and then types of AI that should just be outright prohibited. And so having that kind of a scalable, I think it's the right approach to be thinking about it. But what is risk, and how do we decide what is risk? And the risky kind of, is it just by virtue of the type of information that you process, or is it the potential for the effect or the impact on the consumer? Maybe it's all three. There's this evolving model of what is risky.
I do want to emphatically say that scaling AI solutions or applying them in development context really requires consideration of ethics, diversity of disability data. And that really is an important point, because if we don't have the diversity of disability data, we then see bias as a result.
We have an entire office we've created in the last few years called the Office of Responsible AI. And this is a whole team of professionals whose full-time job is doing that. And I'm their interface to the human rights community, as well as somebody who works then with the engineering leadership. But our mission is actually to see AI and technology empower everybody.
You say human right, you can talk about ideas that you can share freely. You can talk about your dreams. You can have choices in your decisions in what you want to do with your life and how. But from my side, human rights, it's just the basic needs.